You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Hey everyone, a little bit of a different episode here this week because we need to recap something really important that happened just a couple weeks ago for us. We were at Theology Beer Camp for the very first time and it was quite the weekend. And then we are going to take that discussion and actually segue into a topic that I have been wanting to talk about here on the podcast for a little while and just haven't gotten around to yet. And I don't know why I'm saying that as if it's this big mystery. If you looked at the title of the episode, you already know what the topic is. We will be talking about communion, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, whatever you want to call it. But we have a little bit of a ways to go before we get there and before I can explain how that ties into Beer Camp and why these two are in the same episode. So let's just start off with Beer Camp. A couple weeks ago now, we were all the way out in Denver, Colorado, because there is this thing called Theology Beer Camp. And for some of you, that might sound like a really funky name for an event, but it is very self-explanatory. It is a group of people who love to talk theology, God, the Bible, religion, faith, spirituality, all of the above, and drink beer while they're doing it. So this is something that I became aware of, I don't know, probably like a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I was interested in going because there are a number of podcasts that I listen to that are all connected in this network that they're called the God Pods. I listen to way too many podcasts in a week's time. And as I have grown out the sphere of podcasts I've listened to, these slowly expanding concentric circles here, I started to notice some overlap. And I had people like Bible for Normal People with Pete and Jared, Pastor and Philosopher that we've had on ours. And I've noticed some overlap. And they started talking about when these podcasts would get together and have this Theology Beer Camp. And it was all started by this guy, Trip Fuller, who was like the OG Christian podcast. He's been doing it for like 15, 17 years, something ridiculous. Like before anyone knew podcasts were a thing, Trip Fuller was already out there podcasting. And the amount of content that dude puts out in a week's time is just ridiculous. So anyway, I had heard some of these podcasts talking about Theology Beer Camp, and I was looking into it. I would have loved to have gone last year because if you're going to something like that, you're probably leaning on the nerdy side anyway, in at least one way or another. And they had a little bit of a Star Wars theme going on last year, which if you've listened to even just like one episode of this podcast, you know I'm a big Star Wars nerd. But it just wasn't able to work out last year, so I was talking with Jana about it, and we agreed that we were going to make it out there this year for it. We'd never been out to Denver, but we had a couple of friends that were living out that way, so we figured it'd be a chance to visit them too and just get to see the area and enjoy ourselves out there. So we did, and it was quite the trip. It was not a restful vacation at all, but it was a very good one. Oh, and before I forget, this year's theme for it was Lord of the Rings inspired. Whether or not that will play any role in this later on, I have no clue, but I just figured I would throw that out there. So I went into this Theology Beer Camp with two main goals, and these were not really goals that I had voiced to anyone, but I'm going to share them here with you now, because this is an opportunity for me to be open about where I am in my own journey, and just, share with you all what happened this past weekend and how it affects the podcast. And you know what? That sounded ominous. I promise it's not. It's all good. But I went in with these two goals, and the first one was just very pragmatic and business related. I wanted to be able to network for the podcast because these are the sorts of people that we have had on the podcast already. Tom Ward was there, Pastor and Philosopher were there, and then there were a lot of people that we'd like to have on in the future. So, this was a perfect opportunity to get our name out there, put a face with a name, and meet some people. And the second reason I went was I've really only shared bits and pieces of my personal story on the podcast because this isn't the Colin podcast. This is the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. So we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about the Bible, and just my personality comes through in it sometimes. But I think I've shared enough in the past year and a half that some of you have probably pieced together some of this story, but I'll try to give you just a little short rundown on this right now. So as I've mentioned several times on the podcast, I grew up in the independent fundamental Baptist tradition, and it certainly was not as extreme as some people deal with, but it was much more extreme than many do. And that was something I was fully bought into. I was just put on this trajectory in that denomination from a very young age to move up in that denomination. I was told from a very young age that I was a preacher boy and I was going to be a pastor, and even the pastor of the church that I had grown up in. And that was the whole plan. Like, I got pushed into Bible college for that. And it was all my eggs in one basket. Like, this is what you are going to do with your life. And that is what I pursued. You don't really have a choice when this is what God wants you to do with your life, or at least what people tell you God wants you to do with your life. And in my time at a very, very conservative Baptist Bible college, I actually started to rework my faith. Even though it was an extremely fundamentalist environment, it gave me just enough of a new perspective, being able to see people from other parts of the country that, yes, they were still fundamentalist Baptists, but just to see the difference in how they did their faith compared to what I knew, and to realize, oh, there's more than one way to do this, even within the small fundamentalist circle that I had. And it drove me to rethink everything that I believed, because I was raised to have this very strong biblical foundation for everything. If you couldn't back it up with the Bible, don't have that as your position. Like, you need to proof text everything for your life with the Bible. And so I was being a good fundamentalist, and I was going back to the Bible saying I need to be able to prove my positions are right. And that's what I went in to do, nice arrogant teenage mindset. I wanted to prove that everything I already believed was right. I had no intentions of changing literally anything I believed. I just wanted to back it up with Bible, use God's word as a weapon. And the more I started to dig into the Bible, the more I started to realize, oh wait, maybe I wasn't right about everything, and maybe I wasn't right about a lot of things. And it just started that whole deconstruction process, just pulling at the threads and realizing there's a heck of a lot of threads to pull here. But as anyone who has gone through that sort of deconstruction process could tell you, it's not exactly something you feel comfortable talking to other people about. Unfortunately, in a lot of churches, there's this whole environment. It almost feels like you're in the mob. Like, you have to be really careful who you talk to about what, or you're going to get in trouble. So I had a very small group of friends that knew in varying stages the questions I had been wrestling with and the different positions I was coming to over time as my beliefs were shifting, even while still being in a very fundamentalist environment. And at the time, I had this wonderfully naive dream that I was going to be like the Martin Luther of fundamentalism. I was going to try to reform this thing from the inside out and get it back to the Bible and get back to God. The thing I came to realize over time, though, is that most reformers die young, either health complications from stress or as a martyr. And I did not like either of those options. And this all came to a head back last summer, when the church that I had been serving in had some leadership movements that I did not agree with. And I had voiced some concerns over spiritual abuse that had been happening, and it was not handled well. The leadership there said, yes, we are aware of this. We believe we have handled it appropriately, and we don't want to handle it anymore because good tithers would leave the church if we handled this the way that you think it should be done. And I confronted them that I did not think that was a healthy model for a church, that you make your decisions based on money rather than on the spiritual health of your congregation. And that's where the conversation really took a downturn. By that point, I had already established that I was going to leave that church, which was a very hard decision for me. It was a place I had grown up. It was family to me. Many of the people that are there are still like family to me. I still care about them and love them and think they're very good people. But it was a really hard situation, and it was one of these things where the church leadership wanted us to bow out quietly and not talk about issues that we had perceived were there. And I had seen enough of that happen. And every time I had spoken to a person in ministry who had done that, who had left quietly because they didn't want to cause a problem, they all told me later, I wish I had been more honest with people about why I left, because I realized that by staying silent, I was actually causing more harm, because that allowed the issues to remain and just happen to someone else in the future as well. And that is exactly what happened. And it was a very complicated thing. As you can hopefully even tell by this, I'm trying to be very careful about what exactly I say, because this is not a podcast where I am trying to tear down institutions. I have to realize that the church that I was in was home to me for so long, and it did so much good for me. It caused a lot of harm too, but it did a lot of good. And I have to acknowledge that just like that was true for me, it's true for some people who are there right now as well. And I don't want to take that away from them. So just because I'm in a different place doesn't mean that I need to change everyone else to be in the same place that I am. But some of you may not know this podcast actually started because of that whole situation. At the time, I had been teaching a Sunday school class, and my goal in that class was really to try to get people to think outside the box about the Bible. In fact, we were one of the fastest growing Sunday school classes that they had there, which I think kind of ticked a couple people off because people were leaving other classes to come to ours when they heard about the topics that we discussed and the way we handled questions and all that. Basically the whole mindset that I have come at this podcast with is what I developed there in the class. So that was very much the building blocks of this. And when I knew we were going to be leaving that church, I realized I'm a nerd and I love studying the Bible and I love sharing what I learn about the Bible with other people. So I realized that whether I was teaching a class or not, I was going to keep studying as if I were, because that's just me. And so I said, well, let me just turn this into a podcast. And if any of you who are in this class still want to learn Bible the way that I taught in the class, here's the podcast. And it's just grown from there to the point that now the majority of listeners are people that we have actually never even met from all across the country. And it seems like even possibly a couple other countries as well. And that is so awesome. I had no clue what was going to happen with this. I did not know if it was going to stay with 10 people that I knew for 20 years that were listening to this or not. But it's really been awesome to see this grow. So I say all of that to say that I have been on a faith journey for honestly about the last 5-ish years, where I have been slowly rearranging everything that I believed, always still trying to remain faithful to God, to the Bible, to Jesus, to getting to what these texts would have actually meant in their original context. And that has driven me. That is not something that I have left. I know there's kind of this misconception that when you deconstruct, you leave God, you leave the Bible, you leave everything. And that just hasn't been the case for me, because I've thought several times, and I've thought out loud here on the podcast, especially if you listen to the Ecclesiastes series, you've heard me voice thoughts like this. I said, I don't actually know. I am not here preaching certainty on this podcast, because at the end of the day, we don't know what happens after this life. And we don't know entirely what happened 2,000 years ago either. There's a lot that we take on faith, and that's not a bad thing. We just have to acknowledge that to be the reality. And so there are times where I go, I don't know how much of this is true. But what I've always come back to is if I had to start over completely, if I could start my own religion, I realized that the same foundation that I would try to build it up on matches pretty much exactly with the foundation of what Jesus says and what I believe is actually there in the Bible. So why reinvent the wheel? Why not just try to help other people in their journey, who want something similar? I realized that in the situation I had been in before, I was kind of pulling teeth with some people to bring them along on the journey. Not all, there were definitely some that were more on board than others, but I saw a lot of people who just wanted to stay in the comfort of what they had known in the past. And if you've listened to the podcast at all, we don't do that here. So it just eventually hit me that I'm like, I can either pull teeth for the next couple decades of my life at least, or I can find the people who are already on board with this. I just need to find them. I know they're out there. I just need to find them. So all of that brings us up to this year. I'm just going to be completely honest with all of you here listening, because that's the kind of environment that I want to foster here. I went from 20 years of my life being in church every single time the doors were open. Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, revival meetings, door knocking. When I was in Bible college, we basically had a church service in our chapel every single day that was required to go to for classes. And a lot of our classes were basically mini sermons too. So I had this just completely inundated. It was my life. It was not a part of my life. It was my life. And I had some very godly, wise people, when they knew what was going on with my church situation, that said, don't rush into the next thing. It's so easy when you've gone your whole life focused on one particular goal that you're just going to jump at the first opportunity that comes, and you're not going to have time to heal. You're just going to end up pushing all of that down because you're so focused on the next thing. And so In this past year, we have not been attending a church. There has been 3 times since I left my church that I have stepped inside the doors of a church in that time. And it has been a very difficult process. Again, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat any of this or mislead any of you. It has been tough because that was my whole community. It was my family. And I really thought I was going to live and die in that particular congregation. And again, I want to be clear. I still have several friends that still go there, and I have nothing against them for that. I am not the least bit against church. You are not going to hear me on this podcast diss church or ever try to tell someone that church is a bad thing. No, when it's done right, church is beautiful, and I believe it is a unique institution in the world. So I am not in any way anti-church. But stepping away from it in the past year has been a shock to the system, and it has given clarity to realize things that you don't think about when you're in one particular situation for, multiple times a week for a couple decades of your relatively short life to this point. One of the saddest things to realize in this past year's time has been that my relationship with church died a long time ago. Now, not with God, but with church as I knew it. Again, I am not trying to diss all forms of church, but fundamentalist churches. It died long before I walked out that door. When I was a kid going into teenager, like preteen into teenager, my grandfather, my dad's dad, developed dementia, and it was pretty rough for a while. That was my first exposure to that as a kid, and seeing someone who was, such a kind, loving person in my life as a young child devolve so quickly into someone who had no clue what was going on and would often lash out violently. The reality is, long before my grandfather died, we lost him. And that's what my relationship with church felt like. It was dead on arrival long before I made the decision to walk out, and I was trying to resuscitate a corpse. And again, I want to be clear because I know what me 5 years ago would think if I heard someone saying that. This was not me walking away from God. This was not me stopping believing in the Bible or anything like that. It was that I saw major issues with the way that we did church, and they did not seem fixable from the inside, at least not for me, at least not in this particular situation. And so I say all of this. I realize that was a long, convoluted way of saying this. My second goal in going to Theology Beer Camp is that I wanted to know for myself, can I feel at home again in a church? Because I had been in a church once for a funeral and once for a friend who had just taken over as pastor of a new church. We went there to support him. So this was only the third time I had been in a church since the time that I had left over a year before. And we've had some very supportive and loving friends and family, and we're starting to develop a whole new community here on the podcast that has been so awesome. I have loved it. But any of you who have been on a similar journey know it's not the same thing as having that church community around you. And there's all kinds of things we could talk about with that. That's not the point of this episode. I was raised to have my whole sense of belonging and purpose and meaning and camaraderie and community in this one singular community. And if that works out, that can be very rewarding. If it doesn't, it's a cyanide capsule in your mouth that you didn't know was there. Because when you back out, everything is removed all at once. That is why people say don't put all your eggs in one basket. Fundamentalism says put all your eggs in this particular basket. And then when you leave, well, you better never leave. I had found encouragement. I had found camaraderie. I had found some hope, I guess, talking to some of my friends and family and online communities. But I wanted to know, could I feel at home again in a church environment? Because where Theology Beer Camp happened was a very different environment than what I grew up with. I mean, you can kind of imagine just by the name, right? And it's this whole broad spectrum of beliefs and denominations and backgrounds there. You had people that had recently left fundamentalism and were still there. I mean, you had some people who were still fundamentalists that were just kind of feeling it out. You had people who were progressive Christians. You had people who wouldn't even consider themselves Christians anymore. You had Catholics and Lutherans and Methodists, Mormons, a little bit of everything that was there. Like, I could not believe the variety of people and how we all got along. Like, how I was raised, it didn't matter if the other Baptist church down the road agreed with you on 9 things out of 10. That 1/10th thing just made you go, oh, well, we can't fellowship with you, and for all we know, you might not even be saved. And then to see these people of so many different traditions and faith backgrounds come together and go, hey, I came from a Baptist tradition. Where'd you come from? Oh, a progressive Methodist tradition. Oh, really? Oh, cool. Let's talk about this. And there was no attempts to change other people's beliefs, to try to convert other people, to try to debate anything. It was really just like, let's talk. Let's see the humanity in each other. Because I think we all realized if you're at a thing like Theology Beer Camp, you probably got screwed over by Christians at some point. And so I think we all just really appreciated having people with a shared experience that we felt like we could fully be ourselves in. Because unfortunately, even though a lot of churches like to say we preach authenticity and we want you to be real, that's a big thing, right? Is be real. Churches aren't really made for that. I mean, ideally, I think that churches are very much made for that, should be, but the way that we have done church in America is not made for that. We have developed a culture where you're not encouraged to be honest. You're just supposed to be, if I can borrow the term from the documentary in the last year, shiny, happy people. And that's part of what made the transition out of the church that I had come from both easier and harder than I expected, is that I came to realize in the time since that the people that were there that knew me for a couple of decades didn't really know me anymore. They knew the version of me that was still a super zealous teenage fundamentalist. And a lot of people didn't bother to ask if any of that had changed. And unfortunately, I had just learned through experience in those circles, don't ask, don't tell, is really what it comes to. You don't want people to know what you're actually thinking, because then you're going to get called into a meeting with a pastor or a deacon or a Sunday school teacher, or you're going to lose a ministry you're in it. And so I think there are way more people in churches than we realize who are already on this path. They just don't have people to talk to about it. So putting us all together in one big church and giving us an opportunity to actually be real for real and not be worried about who's this going to leak out to, it was very encouraging. It was very healing. Let's take a quick break here for a second, take a breather, and then we'll go over what actually happened at Theology Beer Camp and whether or not my 2 goals were successful there. All right, so a little bit of what happened. I will say the first goal was very successful. Networking, meeting new people. I got to meet everyone that I had planned to, and then quite a few other people that I had not planned to. If you were following our social media at all during the weekend I was there, you probably saw some of the pictures that I got to put up with people like Tom Ward and the guys from Pastor and Philosopher. Really enjoyed hanging out with them, and Kyle and I got to talk a good bit there. We met Tim Whitaker of the New Evangelicals and Dan Koch from You Have Permission. Got to meet Pete and Jared from Bible for Normal People. Finally met with Tom in person, and he already introduced me to a friend of his, actually a former roommate of his back in college, and that fine gentleman is scheduled to be a guest on our podcast in the near future too. So just gonna throw out a little teaser there. You'll learn more about that in the months to come here. But yeah, met lots of different people. I can't even try to name them all. There are way too many that I met, and I'll just be here forever listing all the different people. But yeah, got to make lots of great connections. Definitely laid out some future podcast guests and episodes we're going to do that I am extremely excited. In fact, right now, today, at least as of the time of the recording, a few days ago from the time that you'll be listening to this, I was able to connect with 2 people locking in that they're going to be in the podcast in the next few months here. So we've got some exciting stuff in the future coming just because of this particular trip. So that in and of itself was extremely successful. And the week was fun. It was overwhelming, but it was fun. It started off with this pre-game session, as they called it, that was called a Sacred Contamination. And it was the whole reason I joined that one is because I actually had a meal involved around it. And I'm a sucker for a good meal. And boy, oh boy, was that a good meal. We did not eat a bad thing that week. Everything at camp was fantastic. But this whole idea of sacred contamination, this is something, I'm just going to mention this here because I definitely want to integrate this into the podcast in the future. But it's kind of this fringe theology that's starting to become a little more mainstream, and I've heard of it on a couple of other podcasts that I listen to, and I think it's really it's going to get some traction. I think it's a really intriguing and helpful concept. So the whole idea of it, we're at beer camp, so of course we have to tie that in as well. Fermentation is often a bad thing. That is part of what makes our food go bad if it sits out too long. But it can also be a good thing. You get beer, you get bread, you get yogurt, kombucha, and any number of different things. So using that same logic, they address the idea of contamination and how we tend to only see that as a negative. But what if contamination could also be a positive? And to build this argument, they drew on Jesus' parable of the leaven going into the lump of dough and spreading out, and comparing that to the kingdom of God, and saying people who grew up like I did in a fundamentalism, in a purity culture, sort of environment in evangelicalism, we were constantly told that the world out there is dirty and it is going to try to destroy you. You have to guard what purity you have. Like, the world is the contaminant, it's always going to get to you. But if you're following Jesus' parable, he did not say that the world is like leaven in a lump of dough. He said the kingdom of heaven is like leaven and how it spreads out. And so the idea that they went with is, if you truly believe greater is he that is in us than he who is in the world, maybe we are meant to be the contaminant. Maybe it's not that the world is so powerful it's going to destroy us and ruin our purity. Maybe it is our love that can go out and change the world. I think you can make a pretty solid argument that that is the mindset Jesus had as well. Think of the diseases that he healed in his day. Think about something like leprosy back then. I realize it's not leprosy like Hansen's disease like we think of today, but still, contagious skin condition, right? And people would have seen the lepers there as being unclean, untouchable, something that is going to contaminate our purity. In fact, there are entire laws about that sort of thing in the Torah. But Jesus doesn't go, oh, you're going to dirty up me, stay away from me. He goes, no, my goodness, my love, my healing, my wholeness is enough that it can overpower whatever hurt there is in you. And so rather than moving away from the contaminant, Jesus saw himself as the contaminant in a good way, and he moved toward them and he changed their life for the better. And what if that is what we are supposed to do as Christians as well? So, I mean, boom, come on, like that is the very first thing that I step into on Thursday afternoon. It's hard to get better than that for a start, right? And then just add in this delicious food that all centered around fermentation too. Like each course had some aspect of the food that had been fermented to get us thinking about that. And oh, I could just keep going on and on about that one particular session. That was arguably my favorite thing the entire week. There was just that first session. It was so good. But then camp officially started. We had a main session, and then they did a concert from Kevin Max. And some of you may know that name, some of you may not. For those of you who do, you probably grew up evangelical in the 90s. At that time, one of the most popular contemporary Christian music bands around was DC Talk. It was actually formed in the late 80s by 3 kids at Liberty University. And after DC Talk broke up, they all went into some very successful alternate careers, because the band was made up of Toby Mac, which, if you know anything about CCM, contemporary Christian music, you probably know his name, Michael Tate, who has been one of the main singers in Newsboys, and then Kevin Max. Now, Toby Mac and Michael Tate remained relatively within the evangelical world. In fact, I'd say pretty strongly within the evangelical world. Kevin Max went a different path, and he went down through this whole faith deconstruction and has used his art, both like painting art and also music and poetry. The guy is so prolific, it's ridiculous. He's used that as a way to voice his journey through all of this. So he actually was there doing a concert to end out our first night, and that was pretty sweet. Second day, we had some more main sessions. We had some breakout sessions. I sat in this one breakout I thought was really cool. It was called From Pews to Couches, Searching for the Sacred After Christendom, and it was all about the church and the therapy office. That's where you get the pews to couches sort of thing. And I think all of us that were there were expecting them to say that therapy has kind of replaced the church for many, and that is something that they said at the start. You know, back in the day, you talk to your priest about something, and today you talk to your therapist. But what I don't think any of us were expecting is that they said that both the church and the therapy office have fallen short of helping you become a whole person. They went off of this concept of the real, quote unquote. Like, you could also call it the sacred, the truest form of being, that sort of idea, the real. Religion hides us from the real. It protects us from the real. We think it's trying to lead us to what is real, to what is sacred, but in reality, it actually protects us from that because religion tells you a checklist of things to do to please the real, the sacred, God. But you can't put the real or sacred or God or whatever term you want to use in a box. And what religion does is it makes it manageable, and you can't manage real. And then the therapy office has come in and it has met some needs that the church has unfortunately failed to, but it has also come short because a lot of times therapy tries to give a completely secular answer to something that can be a spiritual problem. And so in that way, it almost hides you from the real. And it just led to these fascinating discussions and debate even over how helpful that theory was. But also, what, at least for me, the biggest thing that I took away from that particular session is that we can't put the sacred in a box. We can't put our faith journey in a box. We can't say, if I check off these particular items, I'm good. And that's very much how I was raised. Read your Bible every day. Go to church every time the doors are open. Pass out X amount of tracts each week. Don't say a curse word. Don't ever take a sip of alcohol. We had these nice standards. But many a standard does not a good religion make. Reality is messy. God is messy. And when he shows up in your life, it often takes the form of making you uncomfortable with your present religiosity. And you have to break out of that in order to find God in places that you never thought were possible. And again, that is a whole other session that I could just talk for a very long time about, but I'm not going to here. I will say, this is one of my only, I wouldn't even call it complaints. I would just say negative aspects for me personally of Beer Camp is that I did not relate to the main sessions, but I also knew that going in. So that says nothing about the sessions themselves or the speakers. I'm just saying for me personally, I'm not saying they were bad sessions. I'm just saying it wasn't where I was at this point. But I knew going into this that they were going to have this emphasis on eco-theology, basically a Christian response to the planet and how we handle the resources that God has given us in this world. And so a lot of the main sessions were about the ways that we as humans have misused and abused God's creation. All the way back in Genesis, we were told to rule over this world and yes, even to subdue it. But we have taken that and in many ways just turned it to be whatever suits us, and it doesn't matter how this affects the next generations. Now, you listening right now are probably all having a different variety of responses internally to what I just said. And I totally get that. How I grew up, that sort of thing is not even on the table to discuss. Like, we just had this entire mindset of God's going to burn the whole world up at the end of time. So why are we bothering to try to save the planet? Global warming is a myth. None of the stuff that people tell you about the world is real. It's just going to get destroyed anyway, so I'm going to burn my fossil fuels and leave the lights on at my house as long as I want, and yada yada, all that's like, growing up, no joke, I literally heard stuff like that from the pulpit. Like, preachers would brag about how they were going to waste energy and resources just because they could. I think because that's the background I come from, hearing preaching on this sort of eco-theology, it's just not where I am personally at right now. Now, I will say, I agree with it. I do think that God gave us this earth to steward and to make the most of respectfully, and to realize that there are other generations that are going to come after us. In fact, we even touched on this a little bit in our recent Eternal Rest Stops tour. I believe that, biblically speaking, God is not going to give us an all-new earth at the end of time. There's basically just one passage in Thessalonians that gets used for this. Now, there are others that get drawn in, but the main one is in Thessalonians, and it's a very difficult passage that I would argue does not actually mean what we have often interpreted it as meaning. And if you look at the word for new that is used there, of new heavens and new earth, it's not of an all new thing, but of a renewed thing. And so I do actually believe that this earth that we have is something that we as Christians are meant to take care of and not to abuse or misuse or waste the resources of, like they're infinite. I personally believe all of that. But there's just something about hearing it preached that wasn't what I was looking for at this time. Now, there were some people who really enjoyed it. And again, not a bad thing. The whole conference doesn't have to revolve around me. But I just knew going in that was not going to appeal to me as much at this current stage of my faith journey. But the breakout sessions overall were really good. There were some awesome opportunities to just talk to other people. Like one of the lunches, they broke up by region. So if you were from the Northeast, you sat with people from the Northeast. If you were from the Midwest, you sat with people from the Midwest. They had an international table, the whole thing. So I got to meet some other people from New Jersey. I actually met a handful of other podcasters in the Philly area that I didn't even realize we were all so close to each other. They did another meal where you kind of sat by people of similar faith interests, if I can put it that way. Like they had an area for people who are agnostic or atheist or in the nun category, None, not Nun, like Catholic nun, but like they don't feel like they fit in anywhere. They had a section in that same time for people who were in full-time church ministry because there were several pastors that were there. They had an area for grandparents to meet and talk about faith and the family and all. So, there were just great opportunities to talk with people. And the conversations I had, even just with people, like not with other podcasters or anything like that, but just with the other attenders there, was awesome. I met people from literally all over the world. We had people from Australia, from New Zealand. I met a father and son from Canada, and we talked about stereotypes that Americans have about Canadians and that Canadians have about Americans. It was really fun. So we've got all of this going on, and we get to Saturday afternoon. The whole thing went from Thursday afternoon through Saturday evening. We get to Saturday afternoon. I have checked off number one on my priority list there: networking, get in touch with people, get new guests for the podcast, get our name out there. Big success for sure. I honestly, and again, just being totally honest with you all here, I wasn't really sure where I stood on the second goal yet. I had a good week. It was very inviting, very welcoming, very accepting, but I just still wasn't 100% sure if I felt at home or not. I definitely felt better. I'm really glad I went, but as of Saturday afternoon, I was still like, I'm not 100% sure if I would do this again or not. Just for me personally, again, not putting any indictment on the event itself. It was just where I was at. And that brings us to Saturday night, where the whole thing came to a head. At the end of the last session, one of the people leading the event got up and said, "And now we're going to have a communion service together." And so this is how communion ties into the whole thing. That one communion service changed everything for me. To understand why, you have to know what communion was like for me growing up, because every church has a little bit of a different way of doing communion services. For me growing up, it was very much following a pattern. We only did it a couple times a year. I think it was usually like once a quarter, three to four times a year roughly. It was almost always a Sunday night service because we knew the attendance was going to be lower. It wasn't going to have any problem people there. This, just being honest with y'all, I sat in on staff meetings. This is just the mindset of, we're going to try to keep this to the reliable crowd. And the entire service revolved around this. The hymns were picked to center around communion a lot of times. And there was a sermon intertwined through the communion service that always went to 1 Corinthians 11. And it was this very, very somber occurrence. It was always one of my least favorite church services to be in, which is a shame to say about communion because that's like one of the main aspects of Christianity. But it was very repetitive. Almost every single communion service ended up being the same general thing. The message itself changed, but the beats were the same. And it was always revolving around how communion is such a super serious thing that you better make sure that none of your kids partake in this unless they are saved and baptized. And even then, they probably shouldn't until they're like 15 to 18-ish. They never officially set an age on it, but it was always like heavily intimated that the kid should at least be a teenager, probably higher up in their teens before you actually let them have communion. And then we would have these moments of silence where you were supposed to confess any hidden sins to God over this so that he didn't strike you dead if you took of the cup of the Lord unworthily, as the old King James puts it. There was never really any feeling of joy or hope. It felt like you went to a funeral. That was just the vibe. And it was very much fear-based. You have to remember, I was the golden child there. I was the good kid. I was the one that the other parents told their kids, why can't you be more like Colin? I was the kid that all the parents loved and all the other kids hated because the kids realized I was a brat, but the parents didn't. So I got away with murder. And I was the golden child. I was the preacher boy. I was supposed to be the best of the best of the best, sir, with honors. And yet, even I never felt good enough at communion. I never told anyone that. In fact, the past couple weeks is the first time I've ever even said that out loud to myself, let alone to another human being, as I've been mulling over everything here. I never felt good enough. I was always worried about, yeah, sure, maybe I asked God for forgiveness for this one little thing, but what if I didn't really mean it enough? Or what if I go back and make the same mistake or commit the same sin tomorrow? Like, is God going to strike me down for this? And there was just so much fear, and I never felt worthy enough to take communion. If I, as the preacher boy, felt that way, I can only imagine how other people in the congregation felt. For quite a while now, I have believed that we, and when I say we, I mean churches in general, but again, every church has a different way of doing communion, so I don't want to stereotype, but in general, the way a lot of American, I'll just say evangelical and fundamentalist churches do communion is so far off the mark from what is biblical and what the early church would have done, what Jesus would have done, and what the disciples would have done. It is so far removed from that it is not even funny. And I believed that for a while. When I was interning and working at the church I had been in, I always wanted to do a communion service. In fact, there was plans for me to do a communion service, and then that's actually the same year that COVID hit. So I did a lot of things in my time at that church. A communion service was one of the very few things that I did not get to do. And it's probably a good thing because I had plans to blow up our idea of what communion was if I ever got that chance. Because I always thought that, well, not always, but for several years now, I have thought that communion is not meant to be this somber funeral service, but it's actually meant to point forward to the return of Christ. It's supposed to be this hopeful, joyous celebration, and so I wanted to talk about all that in church. I never got to, and that means that it's going to become a podcast topic. And since the communion service at the end of Theology Beer Camp rocked my world in ways that you are going to hear about by the end of this episode, I believed it is an appropriate time to finally talk about communion. So without any further ado, we're going to transition into a segment discussing communion and digging into what that really was in the Bible. I know I'm leaving you hanging with the Theology Beer Camp story, but that's purposeful. I want to end the episode with that story. Hopefully it'll tie everything together in a nice, neat little bow. So, let's talk about communion. Communion has many different names depending on where you come from, and I'm mostly going to call it communion just because that's what I grew up with, that's what I'm familiar with, but it's also called the Lord's Supper, the Lord's Table, Eucharist, Mass, a handful of other things. Eucharist is the earliest term for it in the early church, and interestingly enough, it's arguably the most biblically accurate term for it as well. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 24, Paul says that when Jesus had given thanks, he brake it, meaning the bread from the Passover meal that he and his disciples were having, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you." That phrase that we have in English of he had given thanks, it's actually just one word in Greek, and it's Eucharistesis, hence where we get Eucharist. And the crazy thing is that Eucharist does not mean supper or dinner or remembrance or meal or any of the things that we usually associate with a communion service. It literally just means thanksgiving, hence why it's translated here into English, when he had given thanks. So that should maybe be our first clue that we're missing the mark when it comes to communion, because there aren't too many communion services I've been in where the emphasis has been on thankfulness. Now, sure, they might mention Jesus' sacrifice and how we're thankful that, it atoned for our sins and all that. But if the very word for this ceremony is thanksgiving, if I told you we are going to a thankfulness service and they barely mention thankfulness, you would think it was a misnamed event, and you'd be right. I think a lot of times we have misnamed our communion services. Maybe it's fitting that at least people in the fundamentalist circles didn't tend to call it the Eucharist. I think it just sounded too Catholic or high church for them. But that 1 Corinthians 11 is actually the only passage in the entire Bible where we get the idea of a Lord's Supper or Lord's table. And it's in verse 20 where Paul says, "When you come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat," he says, "the Lord's Supper." And quite literally, it means the banquet of the master. Now, here's the crazy thing. Communion only shows up in roughly 4 passages in the entirety of the Bible. It is a New Testament thing. We're going to talk a little bit in this segment about how it ties to some stuff from the Old Testament, from the Tanakh, but it is something that Jesus established. And it is not in all 4 of the Gospels, despite what many people seem to think. And bonus points to you if you can guess which of the 4 Gospels does not include a communion ceremony at the Last Supper. Pause if you need to. Let us know in the comments which Gospel did not have the Lord's Supper in it. I feel like such a game show host here, right? Is it A, Matthew, B, Mark, C, Luke, or D, John? Well, the answer is D, John. John does not include a Lord's Supper communion service. He does have the Passover get-together before Jesus is crucified, but there is no mention of the bread and the wine. Well, that's actually a whole other thing. There is not specifically said to be wine that they are drinking in any of the gospel accounts. It's assumed, and it's quite probable, but the only indication we have is that at one point Jesus says in one of the Gospels that I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until I return. And that can be grape juice. It seems unlikely, given how often it was fermented into wine. But that's just a little weird, nerdy detail that it is not specifically established whether this was an alcoholic beverage or not. Now, it most likely was, which I know will make any Baptist listeners bristle, but hey, go back and listen to our alcohol episode for more on that. Another side note is there is nothing that says the bread was unleavened. I know this was a big deal in a lot of churches I was in. This is not the case in all churches. There are some churches that don't care whether or not their communion bread is leavened. There were several I was in that were very adamant that this could not be leavened bread, going off of the idea of flatbreads and the Passover meal back in the Old Testament in Exodus. I even knew a church or two where one of the ladies in the church would bake unleavened bread for the particular service. Now, granted, those were very small churches, so they were able to do that. But in the ones I grew up in, it was usually just broken up saltines is what we used as unleavened bread for communion. And of course, non-alcoholic wine, grape juice. It was always Welch's. Or honestly, it was probably Great Value most of the time. But the text never actually specifically says whether the bread was leavened or unleavened, or that people continuing this ceremony on into the future have to abide by those same rules if it is or not. That's never anything that's established. Part of that gets into what exactly kind of Passover meal this was, and I'll get to that in a second. But first I have to finish talking about the Gospels and John not including this, because John does have the Passover meal mentioned. In fact, John is the only Gospel to mention more than one Passover in Jesus' ministry. This is a whole thing where people tend to think that Jesus had 3 years of his ministry. Well, the reason they often think this is because John mentions 3 different Passovers. Passovers once a year, therefore 3 years. But John's the only gospel that mentions that. The other 3 only mention one Passover service each, or ceremony each, and not a service. It's not a church thing. See how easy it is for Christian language to seep into your talking about Old Testament stuff? But yeah, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all only mention one Passover, and it's the one right before the crucifixion. John mentions 3, but that doesn't automatically mean that Jesus only ministered for 3 years. It could just be those are the only 3 Passovers that John had stories to tell about. Jesus could have ministered for 10 years, and those are just the 3 he chose to pick out. It could be that he ministered for 2 years, right? Let's say I start a new project this December, right? I then have the first Christmas since I started the project, but it's only a couple weeks in. And then the next year, 2025, That would be the second Christmas since I started the project. And then 2026, it would be the third Christmas since I started the project. But I've only actually been working on it for roughly 2 years and a couple weeks. So we don't actually know how long Jesus' ministry was. It's not something the text is interested in telling us. And any guess we make is just that. It's a guess. So anyway, all of that to say, the rabbit trails, it's a beautiful thing. All of that to say that John is the only gospel not to have mention of the Lord's Supper, of the bread and the cup, and Jesus instituting communion like this. He has rather lengthy dialogues with the disciples in John in that particular story, but doesn't pull out bread or wine and have this conversation with them. There is mention earlier in the book of his being the bread of life, and some people look at that and think that it's like John's version of communion, but just taken earlier in the book. There's good reasons why that's probably not the case, and I have linked to some resources in the show notes that you can dig deeper into that for, if you find that interesting. The one other main passage, and I would argue this actually gets used more than the gospel accounts, is 1 Corinthians 11, and this is Paul talking to the church at Corinth about their celebration of the Lord's Supper, of communion. There's one other mention in Jude of love feasts that the churches had that some scholars believe was basically just a communion service. I'm not really going to touch on that, but it does bring up a very important point, and that's that communion services today look nothing like what they would have been for the early church. Today, it tends to just be a cracker or a piece of bread and a little cup of grape juice. But for the early church, it was this whole meal, and it was this idea of what they would call an agape feast, a love feast. This is where we all get together and have what good Baptists would call a potluck, or dinner on the grounds, or pitch-in if you're nasty. They would incorporate the ceremony into that. But the main thrust was of having this big banquet together. So I actually just want to go through the gospel account. I'm going to focus on Matthew's. Mark's is almost identical to Matthew's account. Luke stands out as different, and that's a whole thing I don't have time to get into here today. I've linked to a couple resources that go into that in more detail, so if it interests you, you can go down that rabbit hole. But Luke's account of the Last Supper is very different from Matthew and Mark's, and even includes, possibly, depending on how you interpret it, a second cup. He starts with a cup, then goes to bread, then goes to cup. What you'll notice in Matthew, Mark, and in Paul's version is that it goes bread and then cup. What's fascinating, though, is there's a document from the early church. It's one of the earliest Christian documents we have outside of the Bible, and it's called the Didache. Didache. It looks like Didache, but it's Didache. If you think of someone who has a very didactic teaching style, they're very informational, and we talk about something being didactic, meaning that it is teaching, it is instructional. Same root, same idea. So the Didache is these instructions for early Christians. And there's a couple of chapters. Communion gets mentioned a few times in the Didache. It's a very fascinating read if you want to learn about the early church and how different it was both from us today and even also from what was in the New Testament within just a couple hundred years. But there's a couple passages in there on communion, and interestingly enough, in that version, cup goes before bread. So it seems to be something that is fluid, and different Christian traditions differed going back to the very beginning on which was the proper order and whether or not the order even mattered that much. But now let's take a few minutes and go through Matthew's account. This is Matthew 26, and I'm going to begin in verse 17. Before this, you have the woman that comes to Jesus, anoints him, which, it's such a fascinating passage. I wish we had time to go into that. We do not. I see the rabbit hole. I'm going to walk around it. I'm very proud of myself for that. It's so hard to do sometimes. Judas has just gone to the chief priest and offered to hand over Jesus to them for 30 pieces of silver, which yet another rabbit hole because incredible hyperlinking back to the story of Joseph in Genesis there. Walking around the rabbit hole. All right, verse 16. Judas from that point saw opportunity to hand over Jesus. Verse 17. Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare to eat the Passover?" All right, let's stop and talk for a second. Passover hyperlinks us all the way back to Exodus. This goes to when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, We have the 10 signs. We usually call them the 10 plagues, but literally the 10 signs in Hebrew. And the last one was the death of the firstborn. And in order to protect against having the firstborns from your family die by the hand of a really weird supernatural creature, that's a whole nother story for another day, you had to put blood of a sacrificial lamb over the doorposts to your house. And this would be something that the destroying angel would see and then would pass over the house. This was a central celebration for the ancient Israelites and even carries over into modern Judaism today. In a way, you can almost think of it like our American 4th of July. That's when we celebrate the birth of our nation. Well, this is when Israel would celebrate the official start of theirs, leaving Egypt, and it took a little while to get into Canaan, but eventually moving into Canaan. And the whole thing of leaving slavery and becoming free people through that whole time, it has a lot of significance. And so all kinds of traditions arise over the years about celebrating Passover. But those traditions might not look like what you are potentially thinking. Some churches, the ones I was in, never really did this, but we knew some people who did. Some churches will try to get back to the Jewish roots of the Christian faith, particularly around Easter and Passover, and they will often try to partake in a Jewish Seder, a Passover Seder, the ritualistic meal around Passover. And a lot of times churches will try to tie it into the life and death of Jesus and find symbolism in every little aspect of it that isn't necessarily there. Sometimes they'll even find a Jewish person, often a Christianized Jew, maybe someone of the Messianic Jewish or Hebrew roots movements, to come in and lead the church in this Passover Seder. So some of you may be like, oh, really? I've never heard of that. And others of you going, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Well, I hate to burst everybody's bubble, but that is not what the Last Supper would have been like. The whole idea of a Passover Seder and all of the rituals that go with it did not come about until after the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70, roughly 40 years after the death of Jesus. It's entirely possible that some of those traditions were around and starting to form at the time of Jesus, but the concept that the Passover Seder was followed in these particular steps, and this is exactly what they would have said, these are the questions they would have asked, here's where they would have eaten the bitter herbs, and this and that, that's not really established for another 40, 50, even going on 100 years after Jesus. So it was a Passover meal, just not what you may think of it looking like exactly. And Matthew and Mark both place this on the night of Passover. John actually changes the details to say that all of this happened the night before Passover. And you get people who try to rectify these accounts in all sorts of gymnastic ways. I mean, I heard people saying that Jesus actually had two Passovers, one the night before and one the day of it. It kind of gets a little ridiculous sometimes. We just have to realize that each gospel author was telling a different version of the story to get at a different angle of it. And apparently God was okay with that because this is our Bible. And so we need to be okay with that too. But again, I have some resources in the show notes that can go into some of that if you're interested. So Jesus sends the disciples into the city to find this particular house that had an upper room where they could stay at. And there's all sorts of debate about what kind of place that would have been and where it was and why it would have been available and more stuff than we have time to get into today. So they make ready the Passover. And here's where it starts to get into the main stuff I want to talk about here. When even was come, Jesus sat down with the 12. Now remember that. He's with the 12 disciples. And as they did eat, he said to them, truly I said to you, one of you is going to hand me over. And they were very distressed, and began every single one of them to say to him, Master, is it I? And he answered and said, it is the one who dips his hand with me in the dish. That's the one who is going to hand me over. And the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to the one by whom the Son of Man is handed over. It would have been better for that man if he had never been born. Whew, that statement is a whole rabbit hole that, again, stepping around. Then Judas, which handed him over, answered and said, Master, is it I? And he said, you said. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed and brake and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat. This is my body. And he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink all of you from this, for this is the blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the pardon of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So you'll probably notice from this that the way it happened for Jesus and the disciples, the way the original communion service went, if I can call it that anachronistically, is nothing like the way that we tend to do communion. It was very much just them having a meal together. And Jesus took the opportunity to tie his life and ministry to some very key Old Testament Tanakh concepts. See, the idea of God or a representative of God sharing a meal with humanity is not something that is new to this passage. There are Eucharist-like stories in other ancient Near Eastern religions. And more importantly for our discussion today, there is a heck of a lot of precedent for this sort of thing in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. If we just look back to Genesis, heck, go all the way back to page 1, go to the garden, all right? It always goes back to Eden. If you've gotten anything off of this podcast, it's that we always go back to Eden. And it started with heaven and earth united, with God and humanity united. And the whole thing centers around what? Food, whether or not they are going to eat from this tree. And we know in that circumstance they did. And it was a problem because God wasn't there yet. But then the rest of the story of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament, is of God trying to regain that unity with humans. And he almost always does it around a meal. We miss this detail because in our culture today, food is very utilitarian. Food is what I eat to give me energy, to keep me going about my day. We have lost the beauty and the sensuality of food. Throughout most of human history, I'm sure if you needed to eat really quickly, you might be able to grab a turkey leg or whatever's on the table and then run out into the fields and do whatever work you had to finish for the day. But most of the time, meals were very communal. We get everyone together and we're eating together and we're talking about our day, and it's this whole thing that's about connection. It's not just about sustenance, it's about enjoying the time of rest together. But in our culture, heck, we have fast food. And we don't even go to the fast food restaurant and sit down there anymore. It's not good enough for us that they make it fast. We have to eat it fast, too. We just hop in the drive-thru and then we eat it before we even make it home or to the office or wherever we're going. I'm not saying it's always morally wrong to eat fast food. It's probably not a good idea for your health, but it's not necessarily morally wrong. But I think we've lost something when we don't make at least some of our meals a purposeful community experience. That's the way food would have often been viewed back in Bible times. And that's why it was so often a part of a covenant-making ceremony. I mean, just look through Genesis. What's the first thing Noah does when he gets off the ark? He makes a barbecue of some animals that God smells and says, hey, we should make a covenant together. What happens when God wants to visit Abraham and talk with him about the promises of the upcoming land and family that he's going to have in future generations? God appears in human form, and Abraham Sarah cooks a meal for them there. What happens when Abraham wants to make a covenant with the people of the land that he's with? They sit down to a meal together. What happens see, this is a passage no one ever knows about, but oh my word, I'll just blow your mind. Exodus 24, the children of Israel are at Mount Sinai, and God has called up Moses and Aaron's sons and 70 leaders of Israel to come up the mountain and commune with him there. And we always think of Moses up on the mountain, but this is actually a passage, you can check me on this, it's Exodus 24, where 75-ish people get called up to the mountain. And if you jump down to verse 10, these 75-ish people saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet as it were paved the work of sapphire stone, and like it was the body of heaven in his clearness. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand. They saw God, and they did eat and drink. It would be so easy to just read over that and gloss over it and not even realize it's there. But it is such a core detail, because when God wants to make peace with humanity, he invites us to a feast. We could go through more stories of that, but just think with me to the very end of your Bibles. How does Revelation end? The marriage supper of the Lamb, where we are all once again united with God, feasting on some fantastic heavenly food. Now let's return to this traveling rabbi who is aware that his life is quite possibly about to come to an end because he has ticked off the wrong people. And he's meeting with his closest friends, the people he has invested in over the last 3 years. And this particular rabbi believes that Eden can be restored in his day, that he can be a part of reuniting heaven and earth, of reforming his faith tradition back to its roots. And so he draws on imagery from some prophetic writers in his faith's past that said there is going to come a day where God makes yet again a covenant with us. He made covenants with our ancestors in the past, with Noah, with Abraham, with David, but he's going to do it again. And when he does that, it's going to be a new covenant. It's going to be something that brings Eden back about again. When God shows up again and he says he's going to covenant with us again, the next time God invites us to a feast, if you will, it's going to be the last time. It's going to be the perfect time. It's going to be the time where we make all things right. And this traveling rabbi named Jesus says, I'm going to institute that right now. And so he says, this cup that I'm holding, it is the blood of the new covenant. Now, depending on your translation, it might say New Testament, and that sounds so funny since, we have the Old and New Testaments in our Bible, but the word testament literally just means covenant, and I kind of wish translators would just go with covenant, because we don't use the word testament unless we're talking about Old and New Testaments, but it's the new covenant, and he is drawing explicitly straight out of Jeremiah with this. He isn't making this up on his own. This is not original to Jesus. He is drawing on the work of Jeremiah, who said that there's going to come a day where God institutes a new covenant, and Jesus is saying, this is it. I've decided right now we're going to stop waiting for it, and we're just going to say it's here right now. And notice how there's no mention of confessing hidden sins or even of having to continue celebrating this yearly or quarterly into the future. It's just for his disciples right then and there. And he's drawing on several concepts from the Tanakh and from ancient Near Eastern culture of gods and priests and humanity having a meal together. Now, there's definitely a lot more we could say about this passage, but I do want to keep the episode moving and go now into 1 Corinthians 11, because this is where a lot of our ideas about communion, I should really say a lot of our wrong ideas about communion, have come about. The first half of 1 Corinthians 11 is, I was going to say, a landmine. Really, it's a field of landmines with zero free space to step on. So I am just going to completely sidle my way around the landmine field, really the nuclear arsenal that is 1 Corinthians 11, verses 1 through 15. But just realize there's a lot in there about male and female relationships and the different roles men and women play in church and in the home. And again, there's just so many different rabbit holes for that particular passage. So I just want to jump in starting in verse 16, because Paul goes from talking about all of that to what can seem like a really weird transition. He says, if any person appears to be contentious, and that particular word basically means someone who has to be right about everything all the time. Fundamentalist churches could stand to listen to Paul right now, but just saying. For anyone who seems to be contentious, who thinks they constantly have to get everything right, we have no such custom, neither do the churches of God. Interesting. Again, kind of its own rabbit hole, but it's the transition between his thoughts about gender relationships and now moving into communion, because in verse 17 he says, I declare to you that I am not praising you. You come together not for the better, but for the worse. This is one little hobby horse I have to hop on for just a second here, and then I'm going to get right back down so we can keep moving. But how many churches are there that exist today that are getting together not for the better, but for the worse? I realize churches are a mixed bag. They are made up of humans who are mixed bags, so there will always be some positives and some negatives. Even the worst church out there has done some good in the world, and even the best church out there has done some harm. But I really do think that if we look at a lot of churches in America today and Jesus were to walk in, he would say, you're doing all this in my name and you think you're pleasing me, but really you're causing more harm than good. You are not meeting together for the better, but for the worse. It's a sobering thought. But let's move into verse 18 so we can keep the communion service going. I am now off of the hobby horse. First of all, when you come together in the church, I hear that there be divisions, and that's the word schismata, so you can hear schism in there. There are schisms among you, and I partly believe it to be true. For there must also be heresies among you, that those who are approved may be made manifest among you. Those whom God has tested will show themselves among you. That, again, pulling the pin on the grenade, dropping it, walking away. Verse 20, when you come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Kind of translating that a little more loosely, but I think it gets better at the idea. He's basically saying, whatever you're doing, it's not the Lord's Supper. You might think it is, but it doesn't match with what the Lord's Supper is all about. Here's why. Verse 21. Because in eating, every one of you takes his own supper before everyone else, and then some are left hungry, and another is sitting there drunk. What happened? Don't you have your own houses to eat and drink in? Or would you rather despise the church of God and heap shame on the people who don't have enough? What do I say to you about this? Am I supposed to praise you for this? I don't praise you. All right, I'm going to stop there for a minute and preach, because this is the passage on communion. This is the opening context to it, and yet we almost never read this part. In fact, I could almost go so far as to say we never read this part, but who knows, maybe I missed that service. But I don't ever remember hearing these particular verses read in a communion service. We always jump to the next ones right after where I stopped, verse 23 and following. But hopefully you've learned this if you've listened to the podcast for a little while now. You can't ever just read a verse in isolation, or even a small passage in isolation. You have to consider the whole context. What's going on here? These verses are crucial. They inform us of the issues that were going on in Corinth, why Paul was talking about this at all. And it's not the stuff that we would think about when we think of this passage. Remember what I said earlier about the love feasts mentioned in Jude. This was a whole banquet. This was a whole meal. This was not just a little mini communion service. This was a church potluck. And so Paul's saying, here's the issue. You all are getting together to have this meal together. And the wealthy among you are bringing the best food. But they're taking of the food that they brought, and they're eating all of that. They're gorging themselves on that. They're getting drunk on the wine that they brought, while there are people who, for whatever reason, get to the service a little bit later, and all the good food is gone. And they maybe didn't have enough to bring. And so they're sitting there, they're still starving, and you've overeaten, and you're already drunk. Like, do you see the problem here? This is supposed to be a community. This is supposed to be something where we take care of each other. And y'all are just coming here with your expensive food. You're coming in with your steaks and your 20-year cellared wine. And we've got some people here that are eating peanut butter and jelly and barefoot. That's not okay. That's not what the Lord's Supper is about. I have a little bit of a lengthy quote here from J.D. Crossan in his book God and Empire, but I think it really helps us to understand the context of what was going on at this time. So this is Crossan. What happened then at Corinth when a villa owner gave a feast for friends, clients, freed slaves, and maybe even some very special and privileged slaves? Well, such a feast might well have been conducted according to a strict hierarchy, not only with regard to place and seating, but also when it came to food and wine. A feast could be, and often was, a ritual of social discrimination and overt humiliation. At the end of the first century, the Spanish poet Martial complained bitterly in his epigrams about such calculated social humiliation at Roman feasts. And Crossan includes a quote from that particular work. While the throng of invited guests looks on you, Cassianus alone devour the mushrooms. Again, why do I dine without you, although, Ponticus, I am dining with you? Let us eat the same fare. Crossan goes on, one of Martial's patrons was Pliny the Younger, who found such feast discrimination morally repugnant. Here's how he describes two options in one of his letters. Some very elegant dishes were served up to the host and a few more of the company, while these, which were placed before the rest, were cheap and paltry. He had apportioned in small flagons 3 different sorts of wine. One was for himself and me, the next for his friends of a lower order, and the third for his own freedmen and mine. One who sat next to me took notice of this, and asked me if I approved of it. "No, not at all," I told him. "Pray then," said he, "what is your method on such occasions?" "Mine," I returned, "it's to give all my company the same fare. For when I make an invitation, it is to sup, not to be censoring. Every man who I place on an equality with myself, by admitting him to my table, I treat as an equal in all particulars." "Even freedmen?" he asked. "Even them," I said, "for on these occasions I regard them not as freedmen, but boon companions." "Well, this must put you at great expense," he said. I assured him not at all. And on his asking how that could be, I said, "Why, you must know, my freedmen don't drink the same wine I do, but I drink what they do." I love that logic, right? Like, they don't eat as well as I do, but I'm willing to eat what they do. Like, I'm not going to pull out the good vintage, but yeah, I'll have a little Josh Schellers with them. As amusing as that story is, it gives you a little bit of an insight into the mindset of what was going on at this time, because this is first century AD, so this is right around the time of Jesus. And now crossing continues. Instead of patronal discrimination, Pliny preferred patronal slumming. He never even imagined, however, a third option: all guests receiving not only the same food and drink, but the best. In writing to the Romans from Corinth, Paul adds that Gaius, who is host to me and to the whole church, greets you. Imagine, therefore, a patronal meal hosted by Gaius, or someone like him, as the matrix for what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 11. Recall, of course, that those earliest Eucharistic meals were not our present-day morsel and sip ritual, but a true meal, called the Lord's Supper, because it was the style of share meal created by Jesus as a meal symbol of equality within a community that believed in God's ownership of food as the material basis of life itself. The radicality of God's egalitarian Christian meal opposed the normalcy of Rome's hierarchically patronal meal. So how did the more elite Corinthians create this contradiction in terms, a hierarchical Eucharist? Well, imagine that Gaius, or someone like him, invites all the Corinthian assemblies to a common celebration of the Lord's Supper. His peers, who do not work manually, arrive well before others do, and they bring or are served their own better class food and drink. When the time comes to eat, accused Paul, each of you goes ahead with his own supper, and one goes hungry and another becomes drunk. Do you, he asks, show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? Well, Paul's solution is actually a compromise that may remind you too much of Pliny's aristocratic moral complacency. Paul could have insisted that each member bring the best food and drink they could, but instead he makes two suggestions. On the one hand, the haves should eat their better food at home before attending the Eucharist. What, do you not have your own homes to eat and drink in? And again, if you're hungry, eat at home, so that when you come together, it will not be for your condemnation. On the other hand, the order of the Lord's Supper must be in this traditional, and Paul insists that it is traditional, sequence of the invocation and breaking of the bread, the supper itself, and then the invocation and passing of the cup. Unfortunately, that was maybe the best that Paul could get. The haves could still bring cheaper food for all to eat, but at least everyone had to eat together at the same place and the same time from the same food and the same drink. Finally, the Eucharist, or the Lord's Supper, the central symbolism of Christianity's divine responsibility for a shared earth, was fractured badly at Corinth. The equality for which Christ died, bread and wine as separated body and blood, had become a source of tension at best and a symbol of inequality at worst. Paul knew how serious the situation was. His terminal warnings about illness and death, judgment and condemnation indicate very clearly that much more was at stake than common courtesy and public politeness. End quote. All right, again, I know that was a very long quote, but I think it really helps us to understand the mindset of what was going on. We have to get out of this idea of just the little sip of grape juice and the little piece of cracker and calling that communion. This was a full-on communal meal that they shared together. And the problem that was happening at Corinth was not that people had hidden sin. Rather, it was that they had very public sin. They were feasting and celebrating to excess while ignoring the poverty of other believers in that very same church. Let's continue with the passage because it only gets thornier from here. Verse 23, "For I received from the Lord that which I also have delivered to you, that our Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was handed over, took bread, and when he had given thanks," there's Eucharist, "he brake it, and said, 'Take, eat. This is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And after the same manner also he took the cup, when he had supped, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as oft as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes.'" Let me pause there for just a second and interject that this is a key aspect we tended to miss. We always focused on the remembrance part and the part about the Lord's death, but we missed the end of verse 26, "till he come." The whole idea of this celebration is to look forward to the future, to the second coming. This points to a time not just when Jesus is going to be in an upper room with 12 disciples, but when all of humanity will be eating with God in a united Eden, in the renewed heavens and earth. That's what he's talking about. Because remembering isn't just about looking back toward the past. We can remember something about the future too. We're coming up close on Christmas here as we record this episode. And every year since I was a little kid, there's been a tradition in my family where someone in the family has gotten me whatever the Hess truck is from that particular year. It started, I think, actually with like my great aunt and uncle, and then it went to my grandparents, and then it went to my parents. But it's been a relatively unbroken line, missed a few years in there, but I've been able to find most of the missing Hess trucks and fill in the gaps. But like with Christmas coming up, I can call to remembrance the fact that I am going to get a Hess truck this year when it comes out. And I've been seeing the commercials for them lately. So every time I see a commercial, it calls to remembrance for me what is going to happen in the future. That's more the idea of communion. It's not about constantly looking back to the past. Yes, there is an aspect of that because it's talking about Jesus' death, but looking to that past event is supposed to then project us forward into a hope for the future. Again, every church does communion differently, but I have been in enough that just felt like a funeral service for Jesus. As if all we were doing was memorializing his death. It's like we were at a wake for Jesus and just talking about all the good stuff from his life. Like, no, that's not what this is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be a hopeful, joyous celebration of what is to come, not just a somber reminder of what has already been. All right, I am off of that high horse and about to get onto another, because as we go into verse 27, this is where I'm going to get really fired up. Paul says, "Wherefore, whoever eats this bread and drinks this cup of the Lord unworthily will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But let a person examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. Because whoever eats and drinks unworthily eats and drinks damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep." These verses were the center of every communion service I had growing up. It was always focused on this whole idea of if you are not of the purest heart possible when you partake, when you snack on that cracker and take a sip of that grape juice, then God is just going to judge you horribly. You are eating and drinking damnation upon yourself. And so you better make sure your sin list is completely blank before God before you dare even touch the bread or the cup. But is that what Paul is saying? Is that what communion is supposed to be about? Well, you can probably guess what my answer is going to be, but find out for sure right after this quick break. Okay, as we dig a little bit deeper into these verses here, let's just take a second and acknowledge that we are all coming to this passage with some preconceived ideas, with some assumptions about what this passage is saying. And that's not wrong. We all have preconceptions. We all make assumptions. We all have background and bias. But let's do our best to acknowledge that we have that and to set it aside as much as we can for the next few minutes here as we just look at what an original audience listener would have heard when this letter was written, what this would have actually meant to them back then. So going back to verse 27, Paul says that whoever eats this bread and drinks this cup of the Lord unworthily will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. All right, let's just pause there for a second. That word unworthily, it has the idea of doing something that is inappropriate for the given situation. But it doesn't have to be purposeful. In fact, the language used here sounds reminiscent of language that would have been used in some passages back in Leviticus regarding what became known as sins of ignorance. And sins of ignorance in the Levitical law included taking something unintentionally that belonged to God or killing someone accidentally. Those were the two main categories of what would be called a sin of ignorance. If you accidentally took something that belonged to God, like this had already been dedicated to God by someone else, but you didn't realize it, and let's say it was food. There was some bread on the table. You didn't realize the person had set it aside for the temple, and you took some of that. That would be a sin of ignorance in the Bible, or a situation of manslaughter, where there was an accidental killing of someone. So the language that Paul is using here sounds like it could possibly be drawing off of that concept, because what he's describing is taking something that belongs to God, holy bread in this case, and participating in the death of another, symbolically Jesus in this case, improperly. But if that's unintentional, the whole point of the laws regarding the sins of ignorance is that there is forgiveness for that kind of thing. If you actually read through those passages, and it's very tedious, so I understand why you wouldn't, the point is not that they are unforgivable sins, rather that they are quite forgivable. I think that we have been missing the point with our stiff communion services. In fact, if we look back through these verses here, again, this is 1 Corinthians 11. It's roughly verses like 16 to 32-ish. So you can look at this yourself too. It's not that long of a read. There is nothing in here, no mention whatsoever of requesting forgiveness from God or others. Eating and drinking unworthily is not this generic term for any hidden sin in our life like was often preached. No, it's actually very specifically defined by Paul's condemnation of the Corinthians just a few verses earlier. It's eating and drinking to excess while others are overlooked in your own community. So all those times I heard the sermons preached before communion to guilt us into either not taking it or praying the, "Oh dear Lord, please forgive me of all my sins I have somehow forgotten to confess to you, amen," sort of prayer, right? All along, this was never about the person who viewed pornography earlier in the week, or who said a curse word at work, or who missed their morning devotions on Tuesday, or the person who showed a little too much skin at the beach this summer. All the stuff that we preached about and heard preached about, that these are the things that you need to make sure you confess before God before you take communion, or else he's going to strike you down. No, 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 no. That is not at all what Paul was talking about. He has no mention here whatsoever of confessing your private little individual sins that you think no one else knows about. No, eating and drinking communion unworthily is not about some hidden sin in your life that you don't want the pastor to know about. It is entirely about the public sin of living in opulence while there are other people within your own community who are living in poverty. And this was something I saw in some churches I was in. We had a wide demographic. We had some people that were essentially living in mini mansions, and then we had some that didn't know how they were going to pay the electric bill this month. And I think that's the sort of thing that Paul would have been condemning. That doesn't mean that you can't occasionally enjoy the finer things in life if you have a little bit of financial stability. That's okay. I'm not saying that you have to become poor yourself. But when within your very own community, and especially your very own church community, you see such a gap between the way that you're living and the way that some other people are living, it is your moral obligation as a Christian to step in and try to even the score, try to level the playing field, try to narrow that gap. We have such an individualistic mindset in our culture that we say, "Oh, I don't want charity from you." That's kind of the idea of Christianity, is charity toward each other, right? We're supposed to be showing love and care and concern for each other so that if there is a need, if it gets taken care of right away. There should not be anyone in our churches struggling to pay their electric bill or wondering where the next meal is going to come from. This doesn't mean that we all have to be living in opulence. It's not saying that if you have a multimillionaire in your church, we should all be driving Lamborghinis. But it is saying that if you have people who have more than enough, which, if we're being honest, is the majority of us in America, and you have some who have less than enough, we should even it out so that everyone has at least enough. It doesn't necessarily have to be that everyone has more than enough, but everyone should have at least enough. And if that's not the case, you are violating exactly what Paul is talking about here. And in our hyper-individualistic focus about making this my own little private sins that I have, not confessed to God, we have totally twisted the meaning of this passage into something completely foreign from what it was originally talking about. And let's even keep going here to verse 28. But let a person examine himself, and then let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. It never says here, let's have a time of quiet introspection where we pray for forgiveness to God. No, it says let a person examine themselves. In other words, look around you. Look at what you brought to this communal meal that we're all having together, and look at what the people around you brought. And if you've got steak and they've got PB&J, you've got your 20-year cellared vintage and they've got barefoot, let's start sharing what we've got here. And note the emphasis on let a man examine himself. Let a person examine themselves, not examine everybody else. And this was a whole thing in the churches I grew up in where we were supposed to have our heads bowed, eyes closed. You're not looking around seeing who's taking communion. At least the way we did it for a long time is like we would have these little communion plates that were set up specifically to hold the little mini grape juice cups or to hold the crackers, and we would pass them along. Yeah, you'd have the ushers like go row to row and pass them along. I think I'd probably go so far as to say the majority of churches actually do where you go up to the front, and usually a pastor or someone on staff or a deacon or elder or whatever will then hand you the sacrament. One is not necessarily better than the other, though I do think that the more traditional way where you go up front and take it helps to remind us that this isn't so individualistic. The way we did it, you could just sit in your pew and you think the whole thing is just about you. You didn't have to take that from anyone else. By having to go up and take it from someone else, it reminds you of our interdependence on each other. But since we tended just to pass around the plates, we were keeping our heads bowed, eyes closed. You're not supposed to be looking around seeing if anyone else is, taking the communion or not. But we all did. We all pretend like we didn't, but a lot of people did. And I mean, I know stories of people on church staff or church leadership, I guess I should say, who for one reason or another chose not to partake that week, usually because of this fear mindset that there was something between them and God or someone else, and so therefore they couldn't take it. And then the pastor gets on them the next day in a private meeting and saying, well, why didn't you take communion? Like, do you not understand? If you want the rest of the church not to get nosy in each other's business, that starts with you. Don't be nosy. Like, if somebody chooses that, let them choose that. The emphasis is on examining yourself, not anybody else. Now, however, that being said, if we look at these verses, there is zero indication that Paul expected anyone not to eat and drink communion. You notice again, verse 28, let a person examine themselves, and then let them eat of the bread and drink of the cup. He never says, let a person examine themselves, and if they don't think they're ready for it, or they don't think they're worthy, or they don't think they're good enough, or they think there's something else going on in their lives, that they should abstain, and then the next time we get together and have communion, then they partake in communion. No, he never says that. It is completely assumed here that every person who is present is going to partake in communion. Why? Well, because we have made this so overly complicated. We've worried about what I need to get right before I'm good enough to have communion. The point is not to be good enough to have communion. Like, did we forget what grace is? Grace is we're not good enough, and yet we are good enough. The reality of this passage is so much simpler than we've made it. Examining yourself was simply just looking around the meal and making sure that everyone had enough, and that if you had a little bit that you could share, you share that little bit with someone who needs it. It's that easy. It's not anything that you then have to go back home and contemplate changing your life. Like, it's something you can do in 30 seconds just by looking around you, and then you partake. It's just assumed that if you're there, you are going to partake. That's really important. Oh, but the rant is not over yet, because we get to verse 29, where Paul says, whoever eats and drinks unworthily, now remember, remove the baggage that we bring with that. And remember what unworthily means. It means that you are not considering the imbalance of power and position and resources of other people in your fellowship, in your community, and specifically your church community. That is what doing this unworthily is. Well, whoever does that, they eat and drink damnation to themselves, not discerning the Lord's body. Oh, and that's where preachers really like to harp on. You're bringing damnation on yourself. Well, honestly, damnation is not a good word to have translated there. And I've got a bone to pick with whoever it was that chose that's the word to put in, because it's not a great word. It is a possible dictionary definition, but just because something is a possible dictionary definition does not mean it is the correct dictionary definition or the best dictionary definition for this particular context. Context determines the meaning of a word. This particular word is krima and is related to the root verb krino, which is to judge or to make a decision about something, to pass a verdict on something, to bring justice into a situation. And it's also related to the word krisis, which is where we get crisis in English, which is a judgment. A crisis point in your life is a judgment point, a decision point, a turning point where you have to decide, where you have to judge what you are going to do based on this difficult situation that you are now in. And so when we read verse 29 here, Paul absolutely does not say that if you have some hidden sin in your life that you haven't confessed before God or your pastor or your spouse or your parents or whatever, then you are drinking condemnation on yourself. No. He's saying that if you have not fought against the inequality inherent in your community, then you are bringing krima, crisis, judgment, a decision point, a crisis point into your own life. You are bringing a judgment upon yourself. Now, notice what he does not say. He does not say you are bringing God's judgment upon yourself. There is no mention of who is doing the judging here, who is doing the deciding. Read the verses back and forth as much as you like. There is nothing here that says whoever does this, God is going to strike down. That's what we've thought it said, but it doesn't say that. It says that whoever is eating and drinking unworthily, whoever is not fighting the inequality in their community, is eating and drinking judgment upon themselves. Well, think about what this would be within the original context. Imagine you are someone with means. You have a good amount of resources. You have a little bit of a cushion to fall back on. And so when you get together for the church potluck, you're bringing prime rib. But you haven't looked around and seen the people who are eating PB&J. And so you just start eating the prime rib. What you have done now is you have brought judgment upon yourself, because you're sitting there with a much better meal than everyone else, and everyone else around you is able to see that. And so they are now going to judge who you are based on that. You now have a point of judgment, a point of decision, a crisis point in your life where you have to decide, am I going to continue to pretend like there aren't people who could use this more than I could? Or am I going to reach across the cultural divide here, reach across the class system, reach across whatever my inherent bigotry or prejudice might be, and try to help out other people? I mean, the very end of this verse plays into this whole way of reading it too, because Paul says that that sort of person has not discerned the Lord's body. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I read that with the thought of communion in my brain. So I'm thinking he's saying that they have not discerned that they were unworthy of having communion. And I get how that could be a possible reading, although I don't think it's the best one here. Think rather about how Paul used the idea of a body in his letters. It wasn't about communion and the bread that is eaten there. No, it was a reference to the entire body of the church. The Lord's body, the body of Christ, the body of the church. Paul is saying that if you are the sort of person there who is indulging publicly while others are barely scraping by, you have not discerned the Lord's body. You have not discerned the needs in your church. You have closed your eyes off to the hurt of other people around you. That's the Lord's body that you have ignored, that you have not discerned properly. And what is the result of that, might I ask? Well, verse 30, for this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. Again, don't read in what isn't here. If you're anything like me, you always read that as if it said, for this cause, God has caused many of you to become weak and sickly, and he's basically killed a bunch of you. But it never says that. It says, for this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. It says nothing about God doing this. Remember the context. Remember the situation. This is not private sins. This is a public refusal to acknowledge your privilege in the face of abject poverty right in front of you, in the face of injustice right in front of you. If you had a bunch of rich people in your church who were feasting while there were poor people right in front of them who didn't even have enough for a full meal, what might that kind of malnourishment lead to? How about many people in the church community becoming weak and sickly and even dying? Hello. Friends, this is not some spiritual punishment that God lays on people who have hidden sins when they eat communion. Not at all. And taking that interpretation really cheapens this passage, because you and I both know people who went to church every Sunday and took communion when it was served, but they were abusive a-holes to their wife and kids back home. We've all known people who were on staff at a church or in church leadership, and yet were spiritually abusive to people in the congregation, and yet they continued to have communion because they thought they were good, because they were reading their Bible every day, and the women weren't wearing pants, and the men were reading the King James Bible, and bless God, hallelujah, amen. And then we see that, And we see that God doesn't punish that. They're still alive. They're still healthy. They're still happy. They're still all right. So then it cheapens this verse and it makes it seem like there's no teeth to it. It makes it sound like God is all bark and no bite. Yeah, he's going to strike you down if you do this unworthily. Well, have you seen anyone get struck down that took communion unworthily? Well, no. Then God's a big liar at that point. If you take the traditional reading of this verse, God is a liar. And you might say, oh, he's just being patient. He's being patient with a lot of people then for basically their entire lives. It's just ridiculous when you actually start to think about this, and it doesn't fit the context. It's not about that at all. It's saying that if you have more than enough, and there are people who have less than enough, and you don't do anything to help them, it affects their health. They could very well be malnourished and even die of hunger. That might feel far off to many of us here in America, where we have way too much stuff. But especially in the ancient Near East, that was a very real possibility for a lot of people. And unfortunately, it even still can be today sometimes. So let's recap here because I know this was a lot. Our modern ideas of communion are way off from the way it would have taken place in the early church and in the days of Jesus. The first Last Supper that we have, the first Lord's Supper that we have, is a Passover meal that Jesus was using as a symbol of a new covenant period, of a renewed Eden between God and humanity. And then eventually, and we don't know exactly when, but at least by the time 1 Corinthians was written, it was apparently something that churches were frequently reliving. They were using this as a frequent ceremony and rite and ritual in their congregations. And it seems that the early church did this arguably every time that they met. Because again, this was not just the little bread, the little crackers and grape juice that we have in a lot of churches. It was a full-on meal. It was a time for the community to come together. But the big problem that Paul addresses in 1 Corinthians 11 is not private sins that haven't been confessed before God, but rather of the public injustice of people who have too much not sharing with people who don't have enough. So I hope with this study to turn your idea of communion on its head. If you had the same mindset that I did, that this is a very somber, very funeral-like, boring, fear-inducing service, that is the complete opposite of what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a party. It's supposed to be a feast. It is not supposed to be exclusionary. Rather, it is supposed to be something where we include everyone and bring up the people who don't even think that they have enough to be a part of it. And this is where I get into one last thing that I want to talk about with communion here, because there is so much more we could get into. We could get into different theologies of what exactly happens at communion. Like there's all different theories of what exactly it means for the bread and the wine to become the body and blood of Jesus. Does it literally become that in substance, though not in form, which would be more like a Catholic view? Is it both coexisting at the same time, which is more of a Lutheran and Reformed view? Is it just purely symbolic, which is more like what I grew up with? Does the order matter? We talked about that a little bit, where apparently it really doesn't, since the Didache had a different version than Luke had, which is different from what Matthew and Mark had. We can talk about the role that fermentation plays in this, because it's likely, although not explicitly stated in the text, that the bread may have been unfermented, but the grape juice fermented into wine, which kind of ironically, we took all of that out in our circles, though there are some that still serve actual wine at communion. There are some that serve leavened bread. Does it have to be exactly bread and wine? We had this discussion at college. You know, if you really want to have a communion service somewhere, but all you have is Mountain Dew and Doritos, can it be communion? And that gets into all different kinds of rabbit holes that we don't have time to get down today. I just want to pull the pin on those grenades, drop them, and walk away. But the one thing that I do want to get into a little bit is who is invited to communion. Because there are three main ideas that get played out in different churches and different denominations, and everywhere is a little bit different with it. But the three main ideas are open, close, and closed. So you have open communion, close communion, and closed communion. Open communion is the idea, if you are here at the church today and we are having communion, doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, what you believe, you're welcome to join with us in this if you would like. Close communion is the idea that you have to be from a church of like faith and practice. So, let's say I'm in a Baptist church, and you're coming from a Catholic church, we're having communion, you might not really be welcome to take part in our communion service. But if you're from a Baptist church a few states over and you're over here visiting family on vacation, then yeah, come on, just make sure that you agree with our doctrine. Basically, if you lived here instead of wherever you are, you might attend this church. And then you have closed communion. And I kind of have to emphasize that last letter there so it doesn't sound like close. You have close and closed. Closed communion is that you have to be a member of this particular church. It doesn't matter if you come from another church that literally copied and pasted their doctrinal belief statement from your church to theirs. If you are not a member of this very specific one, you cannot have communion. If Jesus walked in the door of the church, he would not be welcome to have communion because he's not a member there. Now, those are oversimplifications, but it gets you the idea of each one. And there are rationales for each one, and of course the proponents of each thinks that they have the best way of doing it. Now, growing up, we thought that open communion, well, that's what the Catholics do. That's not okay. That's very unbiblical. There were some people that did closed communion, but we often looked at them like they were a little too radical for us. Like, really, you are not going to allow someone else who believes the exact same stuff that you do to join in with you just because they live somewhere else or they attend a different church. Like, there is also the idea in the Bible of a universal body of Christ where we are all a part of Christ's body, whether we all attend the same physical location or not. I know I just really ticked off some people with that statement, but hey, it's in the Bible. I will stand by that. So closed, just, it never really felt right to me. I understand how you could get to that point, but I think it just goes way too far. Close is the position that many of the churches I was affiliated with would have taken. There is a legitimate critique of close communion to say that for all intents and purposes, it is open communion, because you're not usually going around and asking everybody, are you of like faith and practice to us? But in all honesty, even closed communion can be open communion if it's a big enough church. If you have over 50 people, and especially if it's the sort of church where you're passing a communion plate like we did, you're not necessarily checking to see whether or not that person is actually a member of your church. Now, maybe if they go up to the front, and it's like a visitor and the pastor's like, I guess then the pastor could say, oh no, I'm sorry, you don't attend here. You can't take it. I mean, that's just such an awkward situation. And this is definitely a matter that good Christians will disagree on, and that's okay. But I would make a case that I believe open communion is actually the most biblical option following the trajectory of Scripture. There is no single verse you can point to and say, aha, see, it says, therefore thou shalt have open communion whenever thou servest the Lord's Supper. You can't do that. You also can't do that with close or closed either. But I do believe that the trajectory of Scripture, if we look at what communion was all about, has to be open. Here's a few reasons why I say that. The New Testament, what we think of as, the main part of our Christian Bible, is centered, the very name of it is centered around this new covenant that Jesus established. And he said, this is the new covenant that I am setting up right now. That is then put in contradistinction to what you would call an older covenant in what we would say is the Old Testament, in the Tanakh. And if you look both at the Abrahamic and the Mosaic covenants back then, parts of these older covenants by chronology, the sign of the Abrahamic covenant, and that gets carried over into the Mosaic covenant as well, is circumcision. And circumcision was something performed on every single male Israelite child. Or at least it was supposed to be. Whether or not that actually happened in practice is a whole other matter. But that was the theory, is that it was supposed to happen for every male Israelite child. Does a baby who has just been circumcised understand enough of what is going on in the world to have faith in Yahweh and get saved, to use the Christian terminology? No, absolutely not. They're only a few days old at that point. And yet they were considered a part of the covenant family. Not every Jewish baby that was ever circumcised in antiquity was a good person. Some of them became horrible people. Some of them became good people, but some became bad too. And yet they were still considered a part of the covenant from early on. They were still welcomed into that because of the potential of who they could be. And if that is the trajectory of the older covenant, how much more so then is the trajectory of the new covenant welcoming in everybody? Is that not the whole idea of the church? Is this is no longer about ethnicity. This now has spread across the entire world. Anyone can have room at this table. Anyone can come to the table. Is not that the thrust of Jesus' whole ministry? Like, yes, he focused mainly on his own people, but whenever someone came from outside of that, he didn't turn them away. Now, there are some passages where he made it a little bit harder on them than others, but he still took care of them. He still met their needs. And I believe he had a vision for how this was going to go out and change the entire world. And it did. So God's covenants with humans, be they in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, are always about inclusion. They're always about bringing more and more people into this renewed relationship. And I think even if we just look at the gospel account of Jesus having this communion with his disciples, we can be led to the belief that open communion is a necessity. Because remember how many disciples I said were present at this Last Supper? 12. Now, I realize the gospel accounts differ on this slightly, so you can bicker with me a little bit on this. But if we're just going off of Matthew, because that's what I was in, Judas had already agreed to hand over Jesus to the chief priests. And if you believe that Jesus was aware of this fact, either by supernatural knowledge, being the Son of God, or just through his discerning his followers well, if you believe that he was aware of Judas' treachery, which the texts certainly want you to believe, then that means that Jesus himself welcomed into communion, welcomed into the Lord's Supper, someone that he knew was not a part of his crew. Somebody that he knew no longer believed on him. Now, if we don't know human hearts well enough, we are nowhere near as good judge character as we like to think we are. And Jesus himself, who supposedly knew what Judas had already done and what Judas was going to do, and yet he still welcomed him into communion, then how much more should we be humble enough to realize that we don't get to make the judgment of who's welcome at the table? Indeed, was it not all of those disciples who would betray Jesus, who would turn their backs on him, who would run away from him in the next hours? And yet he still welcomed them all in, knowing this. He didn't say, y'all aren't ready for this. Y'all have hidden sin in your heart. Y'all have doubt in your heart. You're not true believers. You know what? When we do this again in the future, then you can have communion. You know, go back home, think about it, and then come back. No, he served them all. And maybe you could say, well, Judas shouldn't have taken it. Well, maybe. Or maybe Jesus saw the potential in Judas and was giving him yet another chance to change his mind. Or maybe he was just saying, Judas, no matter what happens, I still welcome you at my table. Jesus welcomed back all the others afterward. Surely he would have done the same for Judas if Judas sought out that opportunity. So if we can escape the mindset that communion is this fear-mongering service where we have to worry about how ticked off God is at us today, and realize that this is a beautiful communal celebration of the union of heaven and earth, and of the hope that one day all of humanity will be united with God, then maybe, just maybe, we're meant to start living that out right now and welcoming anyone who is interested to the table. It is not our job to discern whether or not we think they are worthy of this. Because is it not Christian doctrine to think that none of us are worthy of this in and of ourselves, and yet God sees us as worthy? He sees the good in us, and he draws that out through Jesus and says, yes, you are actually good enough. So then who are we to tell someone else that they aren't good enough? We have taken on the roles of the forgiven servant in Jesus' parable, who gets his debt forgiven by his master and then goes to someone else with far fewer issues than him and says, now you pay me what you owe me or I'm going to throw you in jail, and doesn't offer forgiveness to that person the way that he had been treated. That's us. That is the role that we have placed ourselves in. It is a role of hypocrisy, and dare I say is the very role of condemnation, of krima, of crisis, of bringing ourselves to a crisis point that Paul warned about. Communion is not some super secret ritual that only people who have ascended high enough into the secret society of the church by getting saved and baptized and being a member of the church can partake in. It is a celebration. It's like if we had a birthday party, right? And imagine if I had this birthday party for my friend and I thought that they were an awesome person, but I said, you know what? Only the people who live in his house can come. So maybe a spouse, maybe a kid, and the family dog. Those are the only people who can come. Well, that's ridiculous. I guess it's not morally wrong, but wouldn't we want to spread the celebration a little bit more if this is such a great person? Okay, that's what happens with closed communion. Closed communion would be like me saying for the birthday party, oh, let's invite in some of the extended family and friends. Let's get a few uncles and cousins and best friends coming in. But then, what if we have somebody from around the corner that sees the party, knocks on the door and says, hey, what's all this about? And I say, hey, this is my friend. I think they're a great person. And, let me just tell you about them. And here, grab a piece of cake. Like, isn't that so welcoming? And just being able to say, you don't have to be a part of this family, but let's celebrate together. Because I think this is an awesome person. Okay, well, I think Jesus is awesome. I think what he preached was awesome. I think the potential for what Christianity could be is awesome. And so why am I going to limit that to a few people who live in the same region that I do and who maybe agree on some of the same stuff that I do? Because we're all different. We might have signed the same statement of faith, but we all actually believe different stuff. Or why would I just say, oh, I'm only going to share in the goodness, the awesomeness of this person with people who believe just like I do? Wouldn't I want to share that around with other people? Wouldn't I want to say the blessing, the bounty, the joyfulness of God is open to you too? And you don't have to be exactly like I am. But maybe if I'm forcing you to, you're not going to want to be. So maybe I should just welcome you in and share the goodness of my God and of my beliefs with you. And this brings me all the way back to beer camp. I realize this has been a very long episode, so for any of you who have stuck around through all this, thank you, thank you, thank you. You are the best. Love you all. You've heard in the last couple hours here what communion meant to me growing up and what it actually meant in the Bible. Now let me tell you about the communion service that changed everything for me on that Saturday evening at beer camp. As I said earlier, I had felt very welcomed, very included, but I wasn't sure if I felt at home there. And we get to the end of that last service and they say that we're going to have a communion right afterward. And they explain as we have this chalice of wine and these pieces of bread that we have broken off, and then you'll dip the bread in the cup of wine, and we also have little candies that everyone takes one candy on their way out because we want you to remember that this is a celebration, this is a happy time. As they said that, I could already feel tears welling up in my eyes. Now, you have to understand, I would not consider myself to be a very emotional person. Now, it seems the older I get, the more emotional I'm becoming, and I'm not entirely sure what to make of that, because I'm not that old. But I don't really cry that much. I felt the tears coming, and as I stepped out of my pew, and I walked up into the line, just so happened to be the line that Trip Fuller was serving, the guy that ran the whole Theology Beer Camp. And just running through my head was the realization, first, that I had not had communion in a year and a half-ish. And second, that communion was always a negative, stressful, fear-inducing thing for me. And yet here, we had just had a little 5-minute mini message, and not one instance of fear-mongering, not one instance of, you better confess your hidden sins before God before we do this. And it really struck me. And as I step up in front of Trip and I grab the piece of bread and I dip into the cup, I think he could see that I was on the verge of tears. And, for all I know, he might have looked down at my name tag, but, headcanon is that he just remembered my name from earlier in the week. And he just looked at me and he said, Colin, you're welcome here. And friends, when I tell you, I lost it. I was bawling my eyes out. I couldn't even put the bread in my mouth. I wouldn't have been able to get it down my throat. And I'm just sobbing in front of Trip Fuller. If you've ever seen a picture of Tripp or you know him, he is a big old teddy bear of a man. And he just looked at me and he said, "Can I hug you?" And I barely choke out yes. And I get enveloped into this massive Tripp Fuller bear hug. And he says, "I'm glad you're here. You belong here." I barely nod as much as I can muster, and I walk away so there's room for the next person to move up in line. As I'm walking away as quickly as possible so that I don't make a scene, probably flooding the aisle with my tears, I step outside, just barely away from everyone, and I pause for a second, and then I eat that piece of bread that had been dipped in the wine. And I smile. I think quite possibly for the first time ever in a communion service. And I unwrap the chocolate that's in my hand, and I savor that as I imagine the goodness of God, the joy of God, and the hope of a better future where we all start to act more like we are united, both with each other and with God. That, my friends, is the power of a good communion service. The golden child, the preacher boy, the best of the best, a spiritual marine as we were called in Bible college, who, due to hundreds of years of bad interpretations and several church staff members that were a little too judgmental, never felt good enough for God, found God for the first time in a long time at a progressive Christian communion service at Theology Beer Camp. That is the power of the Christian message, if you will allow it to be what it is supposed to be. That is the power of communion, if we will choose to be like Jesus and invite in the people that we initially might think don't belong. If we'll add a few extra seats at the table. That's communion, uncut and unfiltered. Oh, there is so much more that I could talk about beer camp and about communion, but this episode has already gone way too long, so I need to wrap it up. I will just say that communion service sealed the deal for me. That's when I felt like, yes, there is actually hope in the church in the future, and I felt at home. And so my second goal was achieved as well. And so much so, I don't want to give away too many details here because we're still working on the details, but so much so that I got to talk with Tripp a little bit, and there is the possibility that next year we may go again to Theology Beer Camp, but not just as attendees. So yeah, I'll just leave that there for now, and we'll deal with more details as they come in the new year. But I hope you all have enjoyed this episode. I know it's a little bit different. I don't usually do life recap stuff. I don't really talk about my personal life that much here on the podcast, but this was something that overlapped both business and personal. And so I wanted to take a little bit of a break from some of the heavy theology stuff that we've talked about recently, though I guess I kind of got into that in the second half. It's hard to get me away from those discussions, all right? I realize some of you may not have cared about the Theology Beer Camp recap, and that's okay, but hopefully some of you enjoyed hearing about that and maybe piqued your interest for some future conversations that you'd like to hear. So we'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments on social media. You can email us, cconn@thebibleuncut.com. You can write in on our website as well. Let us know any future topics you might like us to go into a little bit more, or even guests that you might like for us to try to reach out to and have on the podcast. And let's talk too about communion. What was your experience with it? And how does that relate to what's actually in the biblical text based on what we talked about today? We've got some really good material coming up in the next few weeks as well. I am not going to do my little usual teaser here at the end, though, because I'm not sure exactly what order we're going to do some of it in, so I don't want to promise something for next week that may actually turn out being a little ways from now. But don't worry, whichever one we go with is going to be awesome, I promise. And until then, stay curious and keep welcoming as many people as possible into your discussions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.